Welcome to the Foothills, a Colorado lifestyle and real estate podcast featuring mountain home real estate broker Robert Martin, who has over 25 years of experience assisting clients reach their goals and move forward. Tune in each week for a dynamic conversation with experts, Colorado adventurers, and residents that explores the ins, outs, and specific nuances of buying the perfect mountain home or selling your dream home in Evergreen, Conifer, Bailey, and surrounding areas to catch a glimpse into the Colorado lifestyle that's a part of you.
Welcome to the podcast. Today, our guest is Betsy Kelson. Betsy, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Robert. Thanks for putting this together.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming by. We really appreciate it. Looking forward to the podcast. Tell me about yourself and what inspired you to become a horticulturist. It's hard word to say.
Yes. It certainly is a mouthful. That is true. Some things are very accidental. So, I grew up in Gary, Indiana, which, steel mill, foul breath, foul air, all, something that a gardener probably wouldn't think is the perfect environment. And I came into a family of bug phobics and allergies. So thank goodness my grandparents liked to garden and kind of took me under their wing. And my great-grandfather was actually a well-known rosarian in his time. Once his victory garden was completed in World War II, he turned the entire backyard into like a 200 rose garden. And hybridized roses, until he had to retire from that. So I have good genetics. And my very first garden, I started at 7 years old, have just been growing vegetables and flowers and houseplants for the last 40, 55 years, probably. It's been a long road.
Been at it for a while. That's great.
Yes, for sure.
So like growing up in Gary, Indiana, I know there's a song that talks about it. And also, isn't that where the Jacksons were from?
Oh, yes. Michael and I are the same age, or were the same age before his passing. He was a big deal. But, living in northern Indiana, it's a very industrial area. So, up until 1971, when they, passed the Clean Air Act, it was not uncommon to be able to taste the air that you were, out there playing, at the school and that kind of thing. So, when we had all these wildfires, last summer and the summer before, it was almost like a flashback to that time of my life where you could just taste and see the air. And it kind of made me really sad.
Gosh, I bet it did. Yeah. And that's one of the things, that's why we like living in Colorado, because of the clean air and, the wildlife and being out in the beautiful outdoors. What drew you to Colorado? How did you end up here?
Well, it was an interesting meeting of minds, but every decade I kept moving south in Indiana. So I started in Gary. I jumped down to West Lafayette to go to school at Purdue University to become a horticulturalist.
Very good. Nice.
Because I couldn't get into veterinary medicine, so I decided to go with the plant end of my passion, and just kept moving slowly south every decade. So when I hit Bloomington, I thought, well, the next place is going to be Cincinnati. But I kind of ran back into an old flame from college. And he happened to live here in Colorado. And so after a year's long distance relationship, I moved out to Colorado and have never regretted the 25 years I've lived here.
That's wonderful. And he's still the flame, huh?
He is still the flame.
That's great. Can you talk about raised garden beds and why they are beneficial?
Well, if anyone has ever tried to stick a shovel into the ground, either up here in the foothills or even down on the plains, you either have rock or you have concrete. Yeah. Or plate or dried Play-Doh is what you usually have. So, it can take many, many years to have an in-ground garden, and with your soil amendments and everything that you would need to get that original native soil to something growable. At least here in Colorado, it seems like the perfect way to get around that is to go above ground. So my garden on my deck is nothing but a bunch of pots, but they're huge, and I can grow flowers and some shrubs, perennials, and vegetable garden, all up off the ground in raised containers.
And you can pretty much grow anything in there. Obviously, it's seasonal according to the weather, but vegetables
Absolutely.
or different types of flowers and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you can just kind of choose what you want depending on where you live. I have a south-facing deck, so I can usually get started a little bit sooner than some folks that might have a north-facing deck. And having raised beds in big pots up on a deck discourages some of our worst nightmares in the animal world.
Yeah.
So at least it keeps it from the deer and the elk, is what the main purpose was. Because many of us don't want to put up a fence to keep them out, which is an option in some neighborhoods. But in other neighborhoods, fences are not something that the HOAs let us do.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I know we have some aspen trees that we planted in the last year, and without the the fencing around it, I think I don't know if they'd still be around. So until they get a little
Probably
older,
not.
maybe, yeah,
Yeah,
a little
probably
bit more
when they
mature.
get a little bit older, you'll be able to remove the fences. But these are tasty tidbits to them right now at that size.
Yeah, for sure. Is there a recipe for good soil, Betsy? I mean, as far as what if you did, I know that when you talked about the hardness of the soil and just lack of nutrients, possibly there are things that you can add to it to make it to where it is, add some minerals that you can grow.
Absolutely. Because you're going to be building your own soil, you're totally in charge. You're like playing God with the soil. So, a lot of the pre-mixes that you can buy by the truckload are usually a sandy loam topsoil, which, helps with the drainage, as well as some compost. But by the time some of these composts that they get from chicken or dairy cow manures, most of the nutrients that we hope are in there have probably either washed out or they just aren't there anymore through the composting process. So it's often a good idea to supercharge your soil with either a synthetic or an organic fertilizer, and just make sure that you have like a good start. So some of the organics, the nice thing about them is that they're very slow release. You can rarely make a mistake overdoing it. And many of the mixes that are out there on the market, or if you're making your own, already have some of the beneficial bacteria and the soil fauna that help plants grow. It's sort of like a symbiotic relationship.
What would be a couple varieties or something that possibly someone could pick up?
Well, probably in the organic line, it's funny, but a lot of the best organic fertilizers come out of California, where these sneaky marijuana growers at one time came up with all these beautiful formulas, and they're just great to use in our vegetable and flower beds. So they'll have things like bat guano, oyster shells, things that are coming from nature, blood meals, bone meals, and then they'll add a big long word called mycorrhiza, which help bind with the root system so that they take advantage of all the good stuff that you just put in that soil to make your plants grow really awesome.
So those would be some words you'd possibly look for when you're
big
looking for a
words, yes,
fertilizer.
but
Yeah.
Just a nice slow release, because many of our synthetic fertilizers, their prices are going up with the price of crude oil. So it's oil and gas, and some people just don't want to go there with their gardens. So
as you know, Betsy, most of the properties are in the foothills. It range from 7,000 feet, maybe a little lower, up to 10,000 feet in the foothills outside of Denver, not too far into the mountains. So the plants and flowers that can be grown up in high altitudes, it's pretty varied, isn't it? Or what? And the different types of foods you could grow, that sort of a thing.
in general, I mean, a lot of folks will go to extremes to grow a tomato, whether they're down on the plains or at 10,000 feet. So those folks that are up at 10,000 feet are either going to be growing most of the tomatoes in greenhouses or in sunrooms that they might have attached to their homes, or they're very, very specific as to which tomato varieties work better in a colder climate with a shorter season. So those folks that are out shopping for tomatoes, a lot of times they'll just have maybe room for five tomato plants. So I always recommend that they get cherry tomatoes for sure, because nothing seems to bother a cherry tomato except a heavy frost. I'll encourage an early girl tomato, which is about a 4 to 6 inch or 4 to 6 ounce tomato, which is a nice small slicer, because it only needs about 55 to 65 days of growing season, which anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000, that's kind of where we are with our growing season. This year's been particularly different. It's been a long time since the frost has held off this long. There are other ones.
Kind of late though, didn't it? I mean,
it is. I mean, it's
season.
Been really kind
May
of
or so.
Yeah. I mean, I think the shortest growing season I ever saw at my house at 7,800 was there was a 6-inch snow on June the 11th. And then Labor Day weekend, we had a 6-inch snow, which gave us an 85-day growing season. If you're looking for particular tomatoes that like it cold, look for things with words like Russian, Siberian, Czechoslovakian varieties. They're smaller tomatoes. You'll never get, like a monster heirloom tomato to grow at our elevation, but the little ones are just as tasty, and at least you'll be able to get a tomato.
So tomatoes are good.
Tomatoes are good.
Other types of foods, and
most people like the salad bowl stuff, because with our cool nights, it can go down, below 40 almost any day in the summertime up here. So salads, lettuce, kale.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. Yeah, but leafy lettuce or
leafy lettuces, leafy greens, dandelions, whatever.
What is the average growing season? You mentioned 85 days, and that's a shortened one?
That's a shortened one. I mean, if you live down on the plains, you probably have 100 days.
Okay, gotcha.
Maybe even 120. But as you creep up, you probably lose, 10 days for every 200 feet. So by the time you get to 10,000, you almost need a greenhouse or, something to, at least grow your leafy greens.
Gotcha. Okay. What are some pointers, Betsy, when we're looking to plant some resistant plants that are maybe resistant to deer, chipmunk, and elk, and that may be impossible, but what are some pointers there?
Well, there are usually huge lists that you can get at most of the garden centers, and the research university, which is Colorado State University, they have lists and lists of deer resistant. I will tell you that, the deer do not read those lists. And part of the year, they may leave most of our deer resistant plants alone, but when it comes time to get ready for winter, much like the bears, they also have to put on some extra pounds to get them through the winter. So they may eat things that you would normally not see them touch during the spring and summer. And if we've had a drought and their normal food sources are really limited, they may eat things that they would never touch, like a pine or a blue spruce, which are our native trees that they'll usually leave alone. But sometimes they will, out of desperation, they will eat that. And all bets are off for deer resistance when the fawns are born, because they're much like human children. They want to try everything, whether mom says it's good for them or not. And so that resistant list just goes flying out the windows when the kids show up.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So there are ways to protect. There are ways to protect, much like you discussed yourself about the aspens having little cages around them. And I try and recommend, some sort of a repellent that even with the ones that are resistant, when they're growing in a nursery, they're getting fertilizer and water and being babied a little bit more to look their very, very best. And I think it dilutes some of the nastiness about them that the deer would normally, not bother with. So deer repellents should go on everything in deer country, at least for the first year till they get adapted to your environment and your home site.
Yeah, it can be frustrating. I mean,
oh, it can. Yeah. I ate everything.
Yeah, it's probably hit and miss too, depending upon the season and what's going on. But I saw one the other day eating out the barberry plant that we have, eating some of the leaves off of that, and it was just chewing on those. So
yeah, and they're very careful. I mean, they won't touch those thorns. It's just like, how do they get their teeth on that little tiny leaf?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. It's very precise.
Yeah,
it was chewing on that thing.
A case in point is that the dianthus family, which is a cute annual or perennial garden plant that is very common, does very well up here in the cool season that we have. And I had a whole whiskey barrel thinking, they'll never eat that. It's in the front yard where the deer have full access. Left it alone until about the 1st of July. And then the fawns just ate them to the ground. And I was like, and it's caught on camera, so I'm not lying.
You think you got them figured out, and then all of a sudden they totally surprise you.
I mean, I went so far as to plant onions in a window box on the front of the house, thinking, they will never eat the onion family. Wrong. Ate all the onions and then finished off with the parsley to freshen their breath.
Oh, nice. Very good. Yeah.
Silly things.
That's great. Why is it important, Betsy, to know the difference between wildflowers and weeds? I know some kind of look similar. What's the importance with that?
Well, I mean, many of the weeds that we deal with that are the most noxious, I mean, 3 or 4 of them are ones that we introduced on purpose because we didn't know that they could be so aggressive without natural predators. I mean, we planted them because the deer don't bother them, the elk don't bother them. They live without minimal water, but when words like aggressive and excessively, excessive are part of their description, it's one of those, red flags for me, like, don't plant that anywhere near, because they can escape out into the wild around our homes where the deer and elk that we love to have around, they won't touch them. So they will leave the area if there's nothing for them to eat. It's like McDonald's, the weeds are okay, but that I can't eat them.
They're not great, huh?
Not good for me.
I mean, not knocking McDonald's or anything.
I should have just said a fast food restaurant.
There you go.
Sorry.
And when we're so we mentioned earlier about Russian sage. Is that one that people, it's it's got a beautiful purple plant, looks great, but it's kind of been changing possibly, or becoming more of a nuisance, or if that's the right word? Or
well, it hasn't. This is entirely my opinion, Robert, because I mean, having moved up here and looking at the beautiful white daisies of the oxeye daisy, or the yellow toadflax, which, the little butter and eggs that look so cute. I mean, those are like 2 of the major noxious weeds up in this area. And the deer and the elk don't eat them. So, and they make huge patches that, because they're just kind of self-perpetuating themselves. But I'm not certain that the Russian sage is going to be that much of a problem up here because of the stresses that they're under. But down in the foothills, after 2 or 3 years of watching them on customers' properties, one cute little plant all of a sudden is 4 times what it was when you first planted it, and it's like eating all your rest of your landscape because it's taking up all of its nutrients, it's taking up its sunlight. I'm just afraid it may, and that's just my opinion.
Well, I've seen,
once again, having the word aggressive in the
in
the description, you're kind of like, oh, that's not a good idea.
Well, I've seen a lot of them, and they've done a lot. Looks like commercial landscapers have used them, for that type of thing. But I've seen them really take hold. So would that be, I guess, if you don't know, for those who don't know, how would you explain what an invasive weed is? And what do you think the best way is to remove weeds, to totally get them out and get them gone?
Well, it is a huge process, and it's one of those, one of those things that just when you turn your back and you thought that, you had gotten rid of the problem, kind of like what we had this year, where we had all this rain for like 3 weeks, things that we hadn't seen for several years. The seed bed can last anywhere from just 1 or 2 years, like when a plant produces more of itself through seed. Sometimes they will only last, maybe the seeds will only be good for like 2 years, but there are weeds out there that we worry about that can survive for 75 years. So you can will your weed problem to your grandchildren.
There you
So, and sometimes you have to pick the battles, which ones are the worst in your yard. So like for my husband and I, we had a huge cheatgrass problem, which is, going to start coming up with probably our fall rains, because it's actually a winter weed. So it actually takes hold now. So if you want to treat it, you can put weed preventers down that should suppress those and kill those as they start to germinate. But, driving in disturbed areas, where they've cut road cuts, all this beautiful green grass starts to grow. And then it turns this nice, lovely buff colored brown in June. And one match, one cigarette butt, so that was like the #1 weed on our property over in Evergreen for like 2 years. And it's away from the road. So that was our biggest concern, is we picked that battle. Let's get rid of that first.
Mm-hmm.
And then we chose another one,
Even if you get rid of the weeds, though, you still, like you said, you still have a seed bed. So
right, you have a seed bed to watch out
seeds
for.
there that you have to be mindful of for years to come, possibly.
Yeah.
So,
and the saying, nature abhors a vacuum. As soon as you clear an area of the weeds, you want to try and find something that you like, that you can put in its place to be a competitor for those seeds. That's going to shade the seeds. So it could be, grass that does some shading. It could be, bulky shrubs or good sized, perennials that spread, that keep the sun from shining on these seeds, so that you can kind of reduce their germination rate.
cool. Could it be a kinnikinick or something? Would that be a ground cover that you could?
It can be a ground cover, like thyme. Thyme works really well up here. Kinnikinick. Some of the English ivies, actually, depending on your elevation, they actually can do pretty well up here, as long as we don't have a super cold winter, but that's been a long time.
So moving on from weeds, which is something
it's my second passion. I should have been a weed person.
Well, I know you also help out with the organization Evergreen with noxious weeds and different things, right? I mean, as far as being able to identify them and helping people control those and eliminate them. So,
yes, at one time I belonged to a group that was trying to manage the weeds around Evergreen Lake, because that's sort of like a crown jewel. And,
sure.
There's nothing worse than having your child go off the trail a little bit, get into this weed that causes hives, it's just not cool.
Yeah, not cool.
So,
plus you also would be carrying seeds around too, wouldn't you?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And that can be a concern, because we sometimes, as humans and even the animals, they'll pick up a seed in point A and it's on their socks or their fur, and transfer it and start a completely different colony, hundreds of feet away from the original plants. So, you need to be mindful, but there's so much we need to take care of. We just need to pick, one plant to concentrate on, is my best advice when it comes to weeds.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. Just be mindful and cognizant of kind of what you have around you, and maybe become somewhat educated on those things. I was just going to ask what your favorite thing is about gardening in high altitudes.
Well, living at high altitude, I usually can't get my garden started until like late May or early June, just because I have to battle snow and late frosts on some of the things I plant, which is why the leafy green vegetables are at least the way to start. working in a garden center, I can start that process in March. So I'm like, I can be a plant nerd for 3 months before I have to actually work on my garden. So I don't have to work on my garden during the busy season where I work. So it helps, it keeps me sane. I don't have to worry about my garden because I'm helping everyone else.
Yeah, that's great. Well, the good thing is you're very helpful and you have a lot of knowledge, and you've certainly been helpful to my wife and I. But if you have a knack for and a real, joy in doing what you do, it's good to get a good start on it if you can.
Yeah, and there are not very many people that can turn their avocation into their vocation for 42 years. So
that's so very true. And when you talk to young people, some of them get it right away. It took me a while to figure things out, and still kind of working on that. But that's a good point. It is kind of rare that those two find synergy, but it's a good thing. That's for sure.
Yeah, and and you can start gardening at any age. I mean, there are people that are going into their first homes for the very first time after living in a condo or an apartment, and poor things, they're kind of lost. So you need to find yourself a mentor or a coach or something like that, because sometimes it's just one plant, one thing that they get it to survive, and they are off and running, and the next thing you know, they have hundreds of plants or a 100-square-foot garden instead of a pot, and they're looking for that next piece of property that's going to be like, I'm going to go bonkers here.
The part of it too is just being confident, like you said, having some experience or a mentor. So what are some great resources?
Great resources.
Yeah.
So here in Colorado, there's like 3 or 4 places that, have really tried. They really know how to do high elevation desert. So the first one, is Colorado State University up in Fort Collins. That's the land grant university that Lincoln started, back in 1865 or 64. And then our local things are the Denver Botanic Garden, which has done a huge transformation in the 25 years that I've lived here. Chatfield Farms down at Wadsworth and Deer Creek Canyon. If you want to see both plant material, annuals, perennials, dry plants, actually growing out where you can see them, in a vegetable garden that, feeds hundreds of people, definitely, take some time to go there. The water districts, many of them, they can see the writing on the wall for these mega droughts that we're in right now. And they have display gardens that show off water conserving plant material that look awesome. The garden at Kendrick Lake on Jewel, between Kipling and Wadsworth. Holy cow. Talk about something that is so gorgeous, and to know that those are all water-wise plants that aren't gonna succumb to a dry spell like some of our eastern plants that have been brought here.
How about some resources for maybe weed control, or just trying to how to manage those?
Well, usually your local garden center, has all the chemicals available to the homeowner. With larger properties like are up in our area, sometimes Big R, Murdoch's, some of the ones that are more farmer oriented, they have chemicals that I can't even have on my shelf because it comes under a different umbrella of chemicals. So you have to be real mindful when you use them. You should be mindful with any chemicals because you just don't know. You want to make sure you read that legal label. Here in Jefferson County, the Weed and Pest Department, which is under the open space heading on the Jefferson County website, they have lists of the noxious weeds that we should be, kind of looking out for and how to deal with them. The Colorado Department of Agriculture also has a huge list, and every county can, have like a top 10 list that's completely different from another county because it's just gone crazy in their county for whatever reason.
What if somebody wanted to touch base with you? Would that be appropriate for them to do so? And
oh,
if so,
sure.
how? Yeah.
Oh, sure. I'm usually, since I live in a tourist town, I choose not to be home or be at home on the weekends because it's just crazy. So I actually work down at a garden center called Jared's Garden Center, which is on Bowles Avenue. I'm usually there from Thursday to Monday when the busiest, most excitement is happening at Jared's.
Well, that's great. And like I said, you've been very helpful to my wife and I, and in the podcast today, a lot of great information that I think people can find a few good nuggets in there for sure. So
I
is
hope
there anything?
so.
Yeah, well, I certainly did. Is there
Great.
anything you'd like to add that we didn't cover today?
Oh, geez. I could go on and on. I mean, you're asking the questions that I get from customers every day. So, it's kind of extemporaneous. And from being a shy person in high school, this is not what I was, that many years ago. So once I have got out of my comfort zone.
Well, you've, and me too, you certainly have acquired a lot of information and very helpful. So I appreciate you taking time today. And I just want to say thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Betsy.
You're welcome.
To the Foothills, a Colorado lifestyle and real estate podcast. On the podcast, I interview real estate experts, Colorado adventurers, and residents who enjoy the serenity and lifestyle of living in our mountain communities. Tune in each week for a conversation that explores the ins and outs of buying the perfect mountain home or selling your dream home, and catch a glimpse into the Colorado lifestyle that's a part of you.